The United Nations is warning that humanitarian operations inside Gaza are nearing collapse. The organization says it's no longer able to distribute food aid in the southern city of Rafah due to a lack of supplies and fears over safety. It says its main aid agency for Palestinian refugees, UNRWA, and the World Food Programme are unable to access their warehouses in Rafah because of Israel's ongoing military operation.
After fleeing Rafah, many come here to Deir al-Balah camp in central Gaza. But the situation here is not much better. People queue for basic supplies. As temperatures soar, they're desperate for water.
If there is no water, we can't shower. If there is no water, we can't drink. If there is no water, we can't do the dishes. We can't do anything. Life stops. We're suffering a lot.
With heavy fighting around Rafah, the Israeli military says nearly 900,000 people have fled the area. These satellite images show the scale of the movement in recent weeks. Hundreds of tents and shelters have been removed. The UN says humanitarian operations in Gaza are near collapse, as almost no aid can enter and they no longer have access to its warehouses in Rafah.
Our colleagues at UNRWA report that today the agency's distribution center, as well as the World Food Programme's warehouses, both in Rafah, are now inaccessible due to ongoing military operation. UNRWA says that its health centers have not received any medical supplies for the past 10 days. Despite this, healthcare staff continue to provide thousands of medical consultations each day at health centers that are still operational.
People had hoped the pier constructed by the US would bring some urgently needed relief. But so far, it hasn't been nearly enough.
We have been waiting for this aid for hours, and we have not received anything. It just doesn't reach us. I ask America, the international community, and all the Muslim world to end this war. All we want is for this war to end.
The US says it's working on creating alternative routes to speed up aid deliveries. Until that happens, many people leave here empty-handed.
Let's bring in our Jerusalem correspondent, Rebecca Ritters, for the latest. Rebecca, we just heard the UN there saying that aid distribution centers in Rafah are now inaccessible. Can you tell us why Israel is blocking aid operations in Rafah?
Well, Terry, Israel maintains that it isn't blocking the distribution of aid, or isn't blocking, I should say, those road crossings into Gaza, and by its own statistics says that on Monday, for example, more than 400 trucks were inspected and transferred to Gaza. Though when you drill down into those numbers, it looks as though some 40 trucks were crossed into Gaza through that northern Erez crossing. And the other numbers that they refer to are mainly the Ashdod port, for example, and crossings with the Jordan and the West Bank that then come through and to be transferred into Gaza. Of course, they also include numbers from this J-LOTS, this temporary pier that the US have built that you just heard about in that report there. So much fewer than the 400 trucks really getting into Gaza. And we're seeing from UN figures that only 69 trucks have made it through since the Rafah incursion began some 2 weeks ago. So really kind of discrepancy in the figures there. And of course, as you're hearing, real distribution issues, even once the aid does pass in and trying to get it to those desperate people who desperately need it. So when we look at the numbers, when we were looking pre-war, 500 trucks a day going into Gaza, humanitarian organisations saying 600 trucks a day minimum are needed to avert some kind of this humanitarian catastrophe that we're seeing. When you look at the figures, you can see the discrepancy in numbers of what's needed and what's getting in.
Rebecca, can you briefly bring us up to date on what Israel is doing with its military operation there in Rafah? We heard in our report 900,000 people have already left that southern city.
Well, that is what we're hearing, some 900,000. That's very close to the number of just over 1 million who were sheltering there. So a large percentage of that population now having left. We're hearing, though, that where they've gone to is also a dire humanitarian situation. The Israelis saying that they've set up these humanitarian zones, but people on the ground, humanitarian organisations saying that they are not satisfactory and not able to cope with the huge amount of numbers of people who are trying to head there. The operation continues, and we've seen time and time again that Israel is adamant on continuing its operation in Rafah, though it has in recent days said that it is going to try to mitigate or, under pressure from the United States, limit these operations in Rafah as opposed to going into a full-scale operation as we saw in other cities.
Rebecca, thank you very much. Our Jerusalem correspondent, Rebecca Ritters, there.
Here's what the head of the UN's Humanitarian Affairs Office for the region had to say about the situation on the ground.
The closure of Rafah crossing has severed access to fuel for humanitarian activities, the entry of critical humanitarian items, and curtailed the movement of staff. Protection of civilians for us remain essential, of course, as it is humanitarian asset and supplies, and we are seeking assurances from all parties to the conflict that they should help us to protect those and ensure respect of civilians.
Let's bring in our Washington correspondent, Janelle Dumalaon. Janelle, what's the latest you've been hearing from the UN about the situation unfolding in Rafah?
Yes, so as we heard, the UN has suspended food distribution in Rafah. Their warehouses are inaccessible to them. Now, earlier, we actually reached out to the UN to ask if they had any indication of when they might be able to restart deliveries. They quite predictably said no, they don't. It would depend very much on the security situation in Rafah and how it unfolds. Now, we don't know for certain how many people are in Rafah exactly. Some 800,000 people are thought to have fled since Israel started its operation there some 2 weeks ago. It's, however, thought that several 100,000 people are still there. And the situation, of course, is very dire. We heard from a spokesperson of the World Food Program who said that food aid distribution had to be stopped in Rafah as well amid exhausted food stocks. She said that food aid distribution is ongoing in central Gaza, which is, of course, where many of those who fled Rafah fled to. But dwindling stocks there also means that they may soon see that supply exhausted as well. She said that if supplies and food aren't restarted in Gaza in massive quantities, then famine-like conditions could certainly be expected there.
And there was this pier being built by the US military that was supposed to provide an alternative entry point for aid. What's going on with that? Because it appears to have stalled.
Indeed, now that U.S.-built pier on the Gazan coast was meant to accelerate deliveries, and on Friday, the first 10 trucks did roll off of a ship onto that pier. But over the weekend, on Saturday, 11 trucks were stopped by a group of Palestinians needing food and aid, and in the end, only half of that convoy made it to the warehouse, and there were no more deliveries on Sunday and Monday. Now, the World Food Program made the point that this issue of people taking aid from the convoys and not waiting for that aid to be distributed, this is going to be an issue that keeps recurring unless the consistency of food aid distribution is guaranteed. The fact of the matter is they see a truck, they see a chance to eat, they don't know when they're going to get another. So the World Food Program is looking into alternative routes within Gaza. It's looking to re-examine its logistics and security measures. But of course, this is a very challenging endeavor at this particular time.
And Janelle, of course, there's the US presidential election looming. How much of an impact is this having on the campaign, particularly for President Joe Biden?
Well, it's a very big problem for Joe Biden, starting within his own party. You have the more progressive voices of his own party critical of Israel and critical of Biden's handling of the conflict between Israel and Gaza. And they are going to have a problem rallying their base and convincing them to vote Democrat come election time. Also worth noting, we've seen weeks of campus protests here in the U.S. as especially young people are shocked by what they see as Washington enabling suffering in Gaza as it stands by its military ally, Israel. We don't know how that will impact the vote exactly, but we do know that that is an expression of a widespread dissatisfaction at Joe Biden's policy, and that will follow him to the election.
Okay, DW's Janelle Dumalaon, live from Washington, D.C. Thank you for speaking to us.